I've always loved hiking, but after what happened last summer, I don't think I'll ever set foot on a trail again. It was supposed to be a simple day hike in the Cascade Mountains, 6 hours round trip to Summit Lake and back. I'd done it a dozen times before, but never alone. That was my first mistake. The day started perfectly. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue. I made good time on the ascent, pausing only to snap photos of wildflowers and distant peaks. By noon I was lounging on the shore of Summit Lake, munching on trail mix and congratulating myself on making record time. That's when I heard a low, guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I scanned the tree line, expecting to see a bear or maybe a cougar. But there was nothing. Just wind in the pines and the gentle lapping of water on the shore. I chalked it up to my imagination and started packing up for the return trip. But as I shouldered my backpack, I heard it again, closer this time. A sound halfway between a growl and a laugh, dripping with malice. My heart racing, I set off down the trail at a brisk pace. Every snapping twig and rustle of leaves had me jumping. The dense forest that had seemed so inviting on the way up now felt oppressive, full of lurking shadows. About an hour into my descent, I realized something was wrong. The trail markers weren't where they should be. Familiar landmarks were missing. With a sinking feeling, I understood that in my haste, I'd taken a wrong turn. I tried retracing my steps, but nothing looked familiar. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me with grasping fingers. And all the while, that horrible sound grew closer. Sometimes it seemed to come from right behind me, other times from deep in the forest on either side. As dusk fell, panic set in. I was lost in the mountains with no flashlight, minimal water, and something hunting me. I tried using my phone's GPS, but there was no signal. The battery died shortly after, plunging me into total darkness. I stumbled through the night, my world reduced to what I could feel with my outstretched hands. Branches whipped my face. I tripped over roots and rocks, each fall bringing me closer to exhaustion and despair. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard it. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. And they were getting closer. I ran blindly, no longer caring about finding the trail. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and whatever was pursuing me. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but still I ran, spurred on by the sound of my pursuer and that awful, mocking laugh. I don't know how long I fled through the darkness. It felt like hours. Eventually I burst through the tree line into a small clearing. The full moon illuminated a decrepit cabin, its windows dark and empty. With no other options, I raced for the door, praying it wasn't locked. The handle turned and I threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me. I fumbled for a lock, a chair, anything to barricade the entrance. For a long moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps on the cabin's porch. Something massive pressed against the door, making the old wood creak and groan. I retreated to the farthest corner, eyes fixed on the door. It bulged inward with each impact. Splinters flew as whatever was out there tried to force its way in. Just as I was certain the door would give way, a miracle happened. Far off in the distance, I heard voices, other hikers calling out. The assault on the door immediately ceased. There was a sound like a frustrated howl, then quickly receding footsteps. I stayed frozen in that corner until dawn, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin's grimy windows, I finally dared to approach the door. Deep gouges marred the wood, and something dark and oily was smeared across the handle. The search and rescue team found me a few hours later, dehydrated and delirious. They said I was lucky. Apparently, several hikers had gone missing in the area over the past few months. I never told them the full story. Who would believe me? But sometimes on dark nights when the wind howls, I swear I can hear that laugh again. I've been an avid hiker for years, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened during my solo trek on the Pacific Crest Trail last summer. The PCT stretches 2,650 miles from Mexico to Canada, and I was attempting a 3-month section hike through California and Oregon. Everything was going smoothly for the first month. The scenery was breathtaking, and I was making good time. I'd settled into a comfortable routine, often going days without seeing another soul. That solitude, which I'd originally craved, soon became terrifying. It started with small things. I'd wake up to find my backpack slightly out of place, or my trail mix bag open when I was sure I'd sealed it. I brushed it off as fatigue playing tricks on my mind. But then I started noticing footprints that weren't mine shadowing my path, always a day behind. And one morning, I found a small pile of pebbles arranged in an arrow pointing towards my tent. My blood ran cold. This was no coincidence. Someone was following me, watching me sleep. I picked up my pace, hiking longer hours and setting up camp in hidden spots off the trail. But every morning there'd be a sign that my stalker had found me, a broken twig arranged in an unnatural pattern, or my bootlaces tied differently. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I started sleeping in short bursts, too afraid to fully let my guard down. The lack of sleep and constant stress were taking their toll. I began to make mistakes, nearly twisting my ankle several times on simple terrain. About a week into this nightmare, I reached a remote resupply point. I hoped to find other hikers or a ranger, someone I could talk to. But the small store was deserted save for the elderly shopkeeper. As I nervously recounted my experience, his face grew pale. He told me there had been rumors of a man stalking solo hikers on this section of the trail. Nothing violent had happened yet, but several hikers had gone missing over the past few years, their disappearances written off as accidents or wildfires. I wanted to quit right then to call for a ride out, but the next town was still 2 days away. The shopkeeper offered to call the ranger station, but it would take them at least a day to reach us. Reluctantly, I decided to push on to the next town. At least now I knew I wasn't imagining things. That night was the worst. Every sound had me jumping. I could have sworn I heard heavy breathing right outside my tent, but when I shone my flashlight, there was nothing there. I broke camp before dawn, determined to cover as much ground as possible. As the sun rose, I heard footsteps behind me, not even trying to be stealthy anymore. My pursuer knew that I knew. I started to run, my heavy pack slamming against my back. The footsteps sped up too. In my panic, I left the trail, plunging into the thick forest. Branches whipped my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I could hear him right behind me. In my blind flight, I nearly ran off a cliff. I skidded to a stop at the edge of a steep ravine. There was nowhere left to run. Heart pounding, the footsteps grew closer and closer. Time seemed to slow down. I knew I had a choice: risk the ravine or face whoever is behind me. I made my decision. I jumped, aiming for a ledge about 10 feet down. I hit the ledge hard, pain shooting through my ankle, but adrenaline kept me moving. I half climbed, half slid down the ravine, not daring to look back. I could hear enraged screaming from above, growing fainter as I descended. By some miracle, I made it to the bottom, my clothes torn and my body bruised, but alive. I splashed across the shallow stream and limped as fast as I could towards where I thought the trail might be. It was nearly dark when I stumbled onto a fire road. A passing Forest Service truck picked me up, and I blurted out my story between sobs. They called in a search team, but they never found any trace of my stalker. I later learned that several other hikers had reported similar experiences in that area. The authorities increased patrols, but as far as I know, they never caught anyone. It's been a year, and I still have nightmares about those footsteps behind me. I haven't gone on a solo hike since. Some say the PCT is one of the most beautiful trails in the world. But for me, it will always be the site of the most terrifying experience of my life. I've been a caver for over a decade, but what happened in Hollow Ridge Cave has left me broken. It was supposed to be a routine exploration, a newly discovered passage that my buddy Mike and I were eager to map. If only we'd known what lurked in those depths. The descent started normally enough. We rappelled down the narrow entrance shaft, our headlamps cutting through the oppressive darkness. The limestone walls glistened with moisture, and the air grew colder as we went deeper. The usual sounds of water dripping and our own breathing echoed out off the walls. But there was something else, a faint rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from the very rock itself. 2 hours in, we reached a fork. Our map showed only one passage, but here were two identical tunnels stretching into the blackness. Mike suggested we split up to cover more ground. I agreed, though something about the idea made my skin crawl. I took the left tunnel, marking my path with fluorescent tape. The passage twisted and turned, getting narrower as I went. I had to crawl in some spots, the rough stone scraping my back. The pulsing grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a sound anymore, I could feel it in my chest, in my bones. After what felt like hours, I emerged into a vast chamber. My headlamp couldn't reach the ceiling or far walls. As I moved further in, my light fell on something that made my blood run cold. cave paintings. But these weren't ancient. The pigments looked fresh, glistening in my lamplight, and the images, they were like nothing I'd ever seen. Distorted, elongated figures, animals that didn't exist. And everywhere a recurring symbol, a spiral with too many arms, pulsing with a faint, sickly light. That's when I noticed the silence. The constant drip of water that had accompanied me was gone. The air felt thick, oppressive, and there was a smell, musty and organic, like rotting vegetation and something else. Something metallic and sickly sweet. I turned to leave and froze. The passage I'd come through was gone. Smooth rock face stood where the opening had been. I ran my hands over it frantically, searching for a seam, a crack, anything. Panic rising, I spun around, searching for another way out. My lamp flickered, the beam weakening. In the fading light, I saw movement at the edge of the chamber, shapes detaching themselves from the walls, unfolding like nightmarish origami. They moved towards me with a jerky, inhuman gait. I caught glimpses of too long limbs, of faces with too many eyes, of mouths filled with needle-like teeth. My lamp died, plunging me into total darkness filled with the sound of shuffling feet and rasping breath. I felt cold, clammy hands grabbing at me, pulling me in different directions. The pulsing was deafening now, drowning out my screams. I don't remember much after that. Flashes of grotesque faces, the feeling of being dragged across rough stone, the sensation of falling, and always that maddening pulse. I woke up 3 days later at the cave entrance, alone and half dead from dehydration. My gear was gone. So was Mike. The search and rescue team found no trace of him, no vast chamber, no cave paintings, no fork in the tunnel. According to them, I'd gotten lost in a dead-end passage barely 100 feet from the main cavern. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. The nightmares haven't stopped. I see those spirals every time I close my eyes. I wake up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat, my body covered in strange, spiral-shaped bruises that the doctors can't explain. The worst part, last week I got a text from Mike's number. Just 3 words. Still down here. When I called the police, they told me the number had been disconnected months ago, right after Mike's disappearance. I'm writing this as a warning. Stay away from Hollow Ridge Cave. Something ancient and malevolent dwells in those depths. Something that doesn't sleep, doesn't die, and is always hungry. And somewhere in the darkness below, it's waiting, watching, ready for the next explorer to make a wrong turn. I've been to many places in this world, places where the line between life and death blurs, where the air feels heavy with something more than just moisture or decay. But nothing compares to the hollow place. The name itself is a whisper, spoken only by those who know of its existence. It isn't marked on any map, you won't find it in any guidebook. It's a wound in the earth, festering with something ancient and malevolent. I found it by accident. I was in a small town in the mountains, a forgotten place where the trees grow tall and thick, where the mist clings to the ground like a shroud. The locals were friendly enough, but there was a tension in the air, a subtle fear that I couldn't quite place. They warned me not to go wandering alone in the woods, especially not after dark. I laughed it off, assuming it was just old superstitions. But then I found the journal. It was in the attic of the old house I was renting, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The leather-bound book was cracked and brittle with age, the pages yellowed and stained. Most of it was mundane notes about daily life, observations of the weather, records of strange illnesses that seemed to plague the town. But toward the end, the entries grew erratic, the handwriting shaky and desperate. They spoke of a place deep in the woods, a place where the earth seemed to breathe, where the trees grew in twisted, unnatural patterns. The author wrote of dreams, nightmares, really that had started to plague him after he ventured too close. Dreams of voices calling to him from the darkness, of shadows that moved on their own, of a yawning chasm that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He called it the hollow place. My curiosity was piqued. The rational part of my mind dismissed it as the ravings of a man driven mad by isolation and illness. But another part, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, couldn't resist. I had to see it for myself. I left early the next morning, telling no one where I was going. The woods were thick and silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making your own breath sound too loud. The path I followed was overgrown, barely more than a deer trail, winding deeper and deeper into the forest. The further I went, the stranger things became. The trees began to twist and bend in unnatural ways, their trunks gnarled and blackened as if scorched by some ancient fire. The air grew colder and the shadows deepened, even though the sun was still high in the sky. I felt a growing unease, a sense of being watched, though I could see no one. The birds had fallen silent, and even the wind seemed reluctant to stir the leaves. And then I found it. The ground suddenly sloped downward, the trees thinning out around a massive sinkhole, its edges crumbling and raw. It was as if the earth had simply given up, collapsing inward to reveal a dark, gaping maw. The hollow place. I stood at the edge, peering down into the abyss. The light didn't seem to penetrate the darkness. It was as if the void itself was consuming it. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't look away. Something was down there, something old and hungry, and it was calling to me. The journal had mentioned voices, but nothing could have prepared me for what I heard. It wasn't a single voice, but a cacophony, a chorus of whispers and screams, all speaking at once, in a language that was more felt than heard. The words twisted in my mind, forming images of despair, pain, and madness. I saw faces in the darkness, pale and hollow-eyed, their mouths stretched wide in silent screams. My legs trembled, and I nearly fell forward into the pit. Somehow I managed to pull back, gasping for breath, my mind reeling. But the voices didn't stop. They were inside me now, crawling beneath my skin, scratching at the back of my skull. I ran. I don't remember much of the journey back. The woods seemed to close in around me, the trees reaching out with twisted limbs, trying to pull me back. The path had changed, the forest itself shifting and warping, trying to trap me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The voices followed me, growing louder, more insistent, promising things that no living person should ever hear. When I finally stumbled out of the woods, the sun was setting, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. I collapsed on the doorstep of the old house, my body shaking, my mind shattered. I don't know how long I lay there, but when I finally found the strength to move, I knew one thing: I could never go back to that place. But the hollow place doesn't let go. The dream started that night. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of those voices echoing in my mind, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I tried to leave the town, but every road seemed to lead back to the house, back to the woods. It was as if the entire world had twisted around me, trapping me in a loop of my own fear. And the voices, they're with me all the time now, whispering in the back of my mind, filling my thoughts with dark, twisted images. Sometimes I see the faces from the pit, staring back at me from mirrors, from windows, from the shadows in the corners of my vision. They're getting closer, and I can feel their hunger, their need to drag me back to the hollow place. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. The line between waking and dreaming has blurred, and I'm not sure what's real anymore. But I know one thing: the hollow place is still out there, waiting, calling to me. And one day soon I'll go back, because I have no choice. It won't let me go. Amelia's toes sank into the cool, damp sand as she walked along the deserted beach. The overcast sky cast a gray pallor over everything, making the normally inviting waters look dark and forbidding. A chill wind whipped her hair around her face as she hugged herself tightly, regretting her decision to come here alone. She had needed to clear her head after the bitter argument with her boyfriend, but now the isolated stretch of shoreline only amplified her unease. The rhythmic crash of the waves did nothing to soothe her nerves. If anything, it sounded almost predatory, like the hungry breaths of some massive creature lying in wait. A gull's shrill cry made her jump. Amelia glanced around nervously, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was. The beach houses lining the dunes were all shuttered and silent, closed up for the off-season. There wasn't another soul in sight. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Amelia quickened her pace, feet splashing through the frothy surf. She just needed to make it back to her car, parked what now felt like miles away. A flicker of movement caught her eye, something dark undulating beneath the waves. Amelia's heart began to race. It was probably just a piece of seaweed, she told herself. But the writhing shape seemed too large, too purposeful in its motions. She stumbled backwards as the water surged up the beach, farther than it should have. The foamy tide swirled around her ankles, tugging insistently. Amelia tried to step away, but her feet seemed rooted in place. With growing horror, she realized the sand was shifting beneath her, sucking her down. Panic gripped her as she sank to her knees. She clawed desperately at the beach, but her fingers found no purchase in the liquefying ground. The wet sand poured into her mouth as she screamed, muffling her cries. The ocean roared in her ears as the waterline crept higher. Icy tendrils wrapped around her legs, pulling her towards the waves. Amelia thrashed wildly, fighting against the inexorable drag of the tide. Just as her head slipped beneath the surface, strong hands seized her arms. She was hauled roughly onto solid sand, coughing and sputtering. Amelia looked up at her rescuer through saltwater-stung eyes, relief flooding through her. But her gratitude curdled into dread as she took in the man's appearance. His skin was pale and bloated, his eyes milky white. Tangled seaweed clung to his sodden clothes, and barnacles crusted his cheeks. When he smiled, his teeth were jagged like a shark's. "There now," he rasped, his voice as dry and hollow as a sun-bleached driftwood. "That was a close one, wasn't it? But don't you worry. I've got you now. I'll make sure you're safe. Down where I live." His iron grip tightened as he began dragging her back towards the churning waves. Amelia's lungs burned as she thrashed in the icy water, fighting against the iron grip of her ghastly rescuer. The taste of salt and decay filled her mouth as she was dragged deeper into the murky depths. Panic clouded her mind, but a spark of survival instinct flared to life. With desperate strength, she kicked out, her foot connecting solidly with the creature's midsection. Its grip loosened for just a moment, but it was enough. Amelia wrenched herself free and clawed her way towards the surface, her vision tunneling as her body screamed for air. She broke through the waves with a gasping cry, gulping in precious oxygen. The shore seemed impossibly far away, the angry sea tossing her about like a rag doll. Behind her, she heard a shriek of rage. Amelia didn't dare look back, focusing all her energy on swimming towards land. Her arms and legs felt like lead, each stroke a monumental effort. The undertow tugged at her feet, trying to pull her back into the abyss. Just when she thought she couldn't go on, her feet touched sand. Amelia stumbled forward, half crawling, half swimming through the surf. She collapsed on the wet sand, coughing and retching. The wind howled around her, drowning out the sound of her ragged breaths. Amelia forced herself to her feet, legs shaking. She had to get away, had to reach her car. As she staggered up the beach, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Dark shapes were emerging from the sea, shambling figures with pale, bloated skin and seaweed-tangled hair. Their lifeless eyes fixed on her with terrifying hunger. Terror lent speed to Amelia's exhausted limbs. She ran, feet slipping on the sand, lungs burning. The wooden steps leading up to the parking lot loomed ahead, a beacon of hope. Behind her, she could hear the wet slap of footsteps drawing ever closer. Amelia took the stairs two at a time, not daring to look back. She fumbled with her car keys, dropping them once before finally managing to unlock the door. As she threw herself into the driver's seat, a rotting hand slammed against the window. The engine roared to life, and Amelia stomped on the accelerator. Tires spun in the loose gravel before finding purchase. She sped out of the parking lot, hands shaking on the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, she caught a final glimpse of pale faces watching her retreat before they melted back into the churning waves. Miles passed in a blur as Amelia drove, putting as much distance as possible between herself and Crescent Bay. It wasn't until she reached the outskirts of town that she finally allowed herself to slow down. Her clothes were soaked, sand caked her skin, and angry red welts marked where spectral fingers had gripped her arms. She pulled over to the side of the road, the events of the past hour crashing over her. Amelia buried her face in her hands, body racked with sobs. How could she explain this to anyone? Who would believe her? As her tears subsided, Amelia became aware of a faint, rhythmic sound. She lifted her head, confused. It was coming from the back seat. With trembling fingers, she reached back and felt around, her hand closing on something wet and slimy. She withdrew a tangled clump of seaweed, dripping with briny water. As she stared at it in horror, something shifted within the mass of kelp. A pale, fish-like eye blinked open, regarding her with ancient malevolence. Amelia screamed, flinging the seaweed out the window. She peeled away from the curb, tires screeching. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. She drove aimlessly through the night, afraid to go home, afraid to stop moving. In her rearview mirror, the road behind her was empty. But Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her, patient and relentless as the tide. She knew with grim certainty that this wasn't over. The sea had marked her, and sooner or later, it would come to reclaim what it saw as its own. She drove on, chased by the memory of cold, dark waters and the inescapable pull of the undertow. The salty tang of the sea lingered in the air, a constant reminder that no matter how far she ran, the ocean's long reach would always find a way to pull her back into its depths. I've debated for months whether to share this story. Part of me still can't believe it happened, and another part wishes desperately that I could forget. But the nightmares won't stop, and maybe writing it all down will help. Or maybe it'll warn someone else away from that God-forsaken place. My name is Alex Chen. I'm 28 years old, and until 6 months ago I was an avid hiker and nature photographer. I'd spent years exploring the hidden corners of the Pacific Northwest, always searching for that perfect, untouched spot to capture with my camera. That's what led me to Black Rock Cove. I'd heard whispers about it in online forums, a hidden gem of a beach, accessible only by a treacherous cliffside path. The few photos I'd seen were breathtaking, pristine sand, rugged cliffs, and the kind of isolation that's hard to find these days. It was perfect for the photo series I was working on, hidden coastlines. It took weeks of planning. The cove was in a remote area, and I had to time my visit with the tides to ensure I could access the beach safely. I packed carefully my best camera equipment, enough supplies for a 3-day solo camping trip, and emergency gear including a satellite phone. I've always been cautious, especially when heading into isolated areas. The drive took most of a day, the last few hours on increasingly narrow and poorly maintained roads. I parked at the coordinates I'd been given and found the barely visible trail leading to the cliff edge. As I approached, I got my first glimpse of Black Rock Cove. It was even more stunning than the photos had suggested. The late afternoon sun painted the cliffs in warm hues, and the waves crashing against the dark rocks sent up a fine mist. I could already envision the shots I'd get at sunrise. That's when I noticed the smell. At first I thought it was just seaweed rotting in the summer heat, unpleasant, but not unusual for a secluded cove. But there was something else underneath, a sickly sweet note that made my stomach turn. I tried to ignore it as I set up camp, figuring it would dissipate with the evening breeze. I was wrong. As night fell, the smell grew stronger. I zipped myself into my tent, hoping to escape it, but it seemed to seep through the fabric. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by strange dreams of dark water and grasping hands. I jolted awake sometime in the early hours, my heart racing. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was or what had woken me. Then I heard a wet, slapping sound coming from the shore. It was a rhythmic, almost mechanical, and utterly wrong. I'd like to say I was brave, that I boldly unzipped my tent to face whatever was out there. The truth is, I was terrified. My hands shook so badly I could barely work the zipper. But curiosity, that damned curiosity that had led me to this godforsaken place, won out. I wish it hadn't. The beach was bathed in pale moonlight, giving everything a ghostly, washed-out quality. At first I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Dark shapes were emerging from the surf, dragging themselves across the sand with jerky, uncoordinated movements. As my eyes adjusted, the truth hit me like a physical blow. They were bodies, human bodies, dozens of them, in various states of decay. Bloated flesh, mottled and peeling. Tangled hair writhing with seaweed. Empty eye sockets somehow fixed on my tent. I'd like to say I didn't scream, but I did. The sound was swallowed by the crash of waves, but it was enough to draw their attention. As one, the things turned towards me. A corpse near the front worked its jaw, as if trying to speak. The wet, rotting sound it made will haunt me for the rest of my life. Panic took over. I scrambled out of my tent, abandoning everything: my camera, my supplies, even my shoes. All I could think about was getting away from those things. I ran for the cliff path, the sound of wet bodies dragging across sand spurring me on. The climb was a nightmare. My bare feet slipped on the damp rocks, and more than once I nearly fell. I was sobbing, gasping for breath, my muscles screaming in protest. But I didn't dare stop. I could hear them behind me, that awful wet slapping growing closer. Halfway up, my foot slipped on a loose stone. I fell hard, scraping my hands and knees raw on the rough path. The pain barely registered through my terror. I looked down, praying I was far enough ahead. The sight below me stole what little breath I had left. The entire beach was covered with the things now, a writhing mass of decaying flesh. And they were climbing. Somehow these broken, rotting bodies were scaling the cliff face, reaching for me with barnacle-encrusted arms. I don't remember much of the rest of the climb. Blind panic took over, driving me up the path with strength and speed I didn't know I possessed. By the time I reached my car, my feet were bleeding and my clothes were torn to shreds. I drove like a madman, not slowing until I hit the main highway. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I collapsed in a gas station parking lot. The attendant called an ambulance, probably thinking I was on drugs. I tried to tell my story to the police, to the doctors, to anyone who would listen. They were skeptical, to say the least. Exposure and dehydration, they said. Hallucinations brought on by heat and exhaustion. They found no evidence of my campsite, no abandoned equipment, just an empty, picturesque cove. But they did find something. In researching the area's history, they discovered records of a shipwreck off Black Rock Cove, dated almost exactly 100 years ago. Hundreds of bodies were never recovered. I know what I saw that night. I know it wasn't a hallucination or a dream. The scars on my feet and hands are proof enough for me. But I can't explain it, can't make sense of it. All I know is that I'll never set foot on another beach as long as I live. All I can do is share my story and hope that it keeps someone else from making the same mistake I did. If you ever hear whispers about a hidden cove, a perfect untouched beach, stay away. Some places are hidden for a reason.